Okay, so we're going to be looking at sacred spaces. Yesterday, we looked at two buildings of Islamic architecture, neither one of them necessarily being a mosque. So today and tomorrow, we're going to focus on several different mosque designs that we see. So yesterday, we were mentioning that when you look at Islamic art, there's some telltale signs that tell us that it's Islamic. Does anyone remember what kind of imagery is typically used in Islamic art and why? What is typically used and why? Go ahead and chat with your neighbors. What is typically used and why?
Oh yeah.
Okay. What are some of the kinds of imagery we see in Islamic art? Yeah. Geometric patterns, right? So we see geometric patterns. We also see a lot of like geometric organization. I can actually put something up here, right? So like geometric frames. What else do we see? Yep. Calligraphy. And so you see calligraphy being used as decoration. What else? Yeah.
They have what plants to like
Vegetation. We call it arabesque. And our theme yesterday was COG. So calligraphy, organic, and geometry. And why? Why do we only see this kind of imagery on images that are religious? Yeah.
Because like they saw any sort of figurative imagery as like idolatry.
Right. And so anachronism is this avoidance of figurative imagery. We have that in early forms of Christianity as well as Judaism. This idea that is against kind of one of the 10 commandments of like graven images or idolatry. And so we don't see a lot of imagery of people or animals unless it's secular, right? So we do actually have it in secular art. So this is part of that theme from yesterday. I put up a mosque. We're going to see something similar to this today, but I wanted to kind of point out the calligraphy in the banning here on the outside of it. The organic, there's organic details covering the surfaces, and then geometric patterning. How it's divided up, how it's organized is often done like this. We'll see other examples today at the Alhambra that really shows a lot of these really cool interlocking patterns. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a few different periods of Islamic art today, and one of them is the Abbasid Dynasty. The Umayyads reigned until about 750, and they were overthrown by the Abbasids. And the Abbasids ruled over the Islamic world until 861. Their capital city was in Baghdad, and they had a palace city in Samara. Now, Samara is today in ruins. We'll be able to see some of those. And they lost their parts of their control, and it became much more regional. And so in your study guide, I have this really basic diagram of a hypostyle mosque. And so I think it's probably really helpful if you have your study guide to try to label the parts of this mosque. Now, we will have a mosque plan for the mosque. Actually, we don't have a mosque plan for the mosque of Cordoba, but it's in this format. And when we see the aerial view, it's going to be helpful to us to understand the basics of construction of this form of mosque. We actually have 3 different styles of mosque that we're studying in this unit. Okay, so you can fill this out in the diagram. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to notice, and this relates to the pillars of Islam that we talked about yesterday, hypostyle. What makes something a hypostyle? Yeah. The walls are columns. So columns hold up the roof, right? So when you look at this, you can see a series of columns going down the length of the structure, okay? What that does is those point you to the Qibla wall. So this whole section right here is called the Qibla wall. That's the wall that holds the mihrab. A mihrab is a niche. Unlike a Christian church with its apse that holds an altar, literally the Qibla wall has a niche, and it's just a directional marker to Mecca, right? It's just a directional marker to Mecca. Why is Mecca so important? What do you have to do? Yeah.
When they pray towards, like, in the direction of Mecca.
Right. So it's a directional marker that says Mecca is that way, and so you direct yourself that way. So if you're at the mosque, you're on your prayer rug, you're probably in this section here. You're in these series of hypostyle halls. They're all directional. So people line and fill the floor, and they're all in rows, and they all form, pray towards that niche that directs them towards Mecca, which directs them to the Kaaba, right, that we studied yesterday. Right, so we have our Qibla wall, and then right in the center of it, can you see how the wall kind of stops there? That's the mihrab. Now, often opposite of the Qibla wall, but not always, we have a minaret, right? And so the minaret is this squared thing that we see right here. A minaret is a tall, slender tower that's used to call Muslims to prayer. A muezzin, they're the caller, they basically sing out and tell people it's now time to pray. And that happens how many times a day? 5 times, right? It happens 5 times. Now, I don't have it labeled on here, but this big open section right here is a courtyard or an atrium. So we've seen this before. We've seen it in Roman houses. We've seen it in Christian churches, right? We've even seen it in Egyptian temples themselves, right? So what happens in those spots? What happens in these atriums, these courtyards? They're large open spaces. People meet there. They congregate there before they go into the mosque. So it's kind of a social place. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we have our rows and rows of columns. This is basically the first style of mosque. It's probably modeled after Muhammad's home, because homes were orientated this way in early times. We see that, like I said, in the Roman houses where they have an atrium, have an open space. Of course, his was probably a lot more modest. And then he'd have his living quarters. Okay, this is the great mosque at Samara. Samara was this palace city, and they're excavating areas of it, but you can see how grandiose this mosque must have been once upon a time. And you can see that a lot of these mosques had fortified walls, and that's pretty much what remains today. We have the fortified walls. You can kind of see that they use rounded arches, architecture, right? And then as you look at the aerial view, you understand the format based on the ruins. So we have that large atrium, probably had some sort of fountain in the center for like purification, kind of this tranquil place to hang out before. And then this is the area where we have the hypostyle halls, Qibla wall, mihrab, right? So this lovely thing right here, this spirally thing must be the what? What do you think? It's the mihrab. Very good. It kind of looks like a spiral cake in a way. There's all different styles of minarets, all different styles, right? This is the Great Mosque in Tunisia, and you can see here what it looks like from an aerial view, but you can identify a lot of the same sort of parts. One of the things I want to mention is that a lot of these mosques all have regional styles, right? There are some fundamental characteristics that are similar, but each style, each region of the world, of the Islamic world, they have their own artistic flair, right? They have their own artistic style. and we see them incorporated into the structure. Okay. So one of the things that we can see here that's evident is what side is the people wall, which is the directional area. What do you think? Trevor, you have educated guess?
Yeah, the wall on the top left.
Right. So on this one, it has a dome over the Mira. So when you're in the city, you can see the dome and you know that that's the direction to Mecca. Make sense? Okay. So we're going to move to the Abbasid Dynasty in medieval Spain. They ruled, like I said, until 750 when they were overthrown by the Abbasids that we saw in Iraq. And they retreated, or not retreated, they moved their territory. So they actually moved to Damascus, Syria, and then eventually they were exiled to Spain. And they ruled in Spain from 756 to 1031. So we're going to look at actually two different structures today that are in Spain. Okay, so the first images that we have are the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Now we have a few great mosques. So that's kind of a pain. I was taught that this was the Great Mosque of Cordoba or Cordova. You also hear that too. Just different translations of the same place. I wish AP did that, but they just call it the Great Mosque. You have 2 pages in your note takers. What I would probably focus on is like the aerial view, right? I'd probably focus on like the aerial view to understand the basic structures of the mosque. And then some of the decorative areas, I would focus on that. So like I would do 1 page for decoration, 1 page for the architecture. So like all the arches, I might group with this part too. Okay. The one thing that looks like an entryway, if you can identify that, I might keep that for decoration because it's like highly complex in design. Right. So does anyone know what part of, so this is the Great Mosque itself, right? What is this thing and how does it relate to the history of the Great Mosque? Does anyone know what this thing is? That's kind of in the center of the mosque. Any educated guesses? It looks kind of familiar to me. I kind of recognize it. Yeah.
They build up a church.
They build a church. And so this is often in Cordoba, this is actually called the Mezquita, which is basically the name for the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba. So it was converted into a Christian church in the 13th century. It still is a Christian church today. There is no calls to prayer at the Mosque of Cordoba. So here you can see the church kind of built strategically in the very center part of the mosque. They didn't, thankfully, put it in the holiest part, which is that Qibla wall mihrab, but instead they stuck it kind of in the center. And so this spot, a little bit of context, it was built originally on top of a Roman temple. We see this all the time in art, right? Or art history or archaeology. What often happens is that there's a holy site and then the next group with a different religion builds right on top of it. Sometimes they keep it, sometimes they destroy it, and they just keep building on it and on it and on it and on it, changing through the millennium. Okay, so it was first a Roman temple, and then the Visigoths converted it into a church in 572. And we actually can see some remnants of the Roman temple and the Visigoths in the interior. And then when the Umayyads came, they created a mosque there in 786. And then, like I said, it was converted back into a church in the 13th century, and it still is considered the Cathedral of Cordoba today. So the cathedral is kind of like the seat of the bishop in the city of Cordoba. So it's like it's the like most important church in the city. But we're going to focus most of our attention on the fact that it was a mosque. Okay, so this is the east gate, right? So I would put this on like the decorative page where you're putting the information. Can you identify the Islamic characteristics on the east gate? Go ahead and talk to your neighbor. What are the characteristics that you see? Okay. What are some of those characteristics that we see of Islamic decoration, especially on holy sites, religious sites? Nicole. It does. So it has, we'll start with the geometry first. Everything is very organized based on complex mathematical geometric patterns, right? So not only do we have shapes, right? We have the arch, it's called a horseshoe arch. It was favored by the Visigoths, and then it was used and exploited at this mosque in Spain, right? So it's kind of a regional style. We have a lobed arch. Can you see this lobed arch? It's symmetrical and based on patterning and geometry. And then of course we have the framework itself, how things are kind of organized in rectilinear elements, in patterning, right? Everything is kind of organized and kind of fit within the niches. You mentioned calligraphy. There is calligraphy across the banding here horizontally. You can sort of make it out, right? So there is calligraphy in different areas. I should also say geometric patterning, all of this kind of organization of material and surface is all based on interlocking geometric patterns. And then it's hard to see, but you can sort of guess that probably filling a lot of these spaces, right? We probably have some of that arabesque as well, right? So we have the decoration and we have that basic structure. Now, I overheard people mentioning that that's a really small door. Any educated guesses why it's a really small door? Look at the walls of this mosque. They're pretty thick, right? So this is a fortified structure. It's a fortified structure. And you can only imagine that this was an area that was changing hands every few hundred years, right? And so, you know, we had Christians and Muslims living together. And so they were protecting their holy site. And so there was actually very small entrances, different gates that you could enter. And all of these gates were pretty elaborate, except for the ones close to the Qibla wall. Excuse me, that's not true. They're decorated too. I apologize. I was thinking of something else. Okay, so let's think about how we just went over the basic fundamentals of a mosque design. Now, we don't have a plan for this, but we have this great aerial view that they've included, and it's pretty close to what we've got for a plan. So what are some of the parts that we can identify by looking at this image? Where's the minaret? Yeah. Right, it's a tower. So this one is kind of square and it's kind of stacked on top of itself. Right next to the minaret, we have this gigantic courtyard. Now this courtyard has a garden of orange groves in it, right? Oranges were common in Damascus. So this is intentionally planted to remind them of home. Right? Now, can you guys see the roof here? Notice how there's a series of pointed gables. You guys see that? Like almost like little pediments. What does that tell us? What's in between each of those different triangular roofs? Yeah.
columns.
The columns. So we have the hypostyle halls are leading us to, what's this wall called? The Qibla wall. And right above the Qibla wall, there is a dome in the mihrab, right? That tells us, right? Oh, so part of my image isn't showing. That has the mihrab under the dome. Now, one of the things, and it's probably in a future slide, that's unique about this mosque is it doesn't point to Mecca. I think that's rather odd, but I think it's kind of cool all the same. It points to Damascus. So once again, that would be functioning as what? Reminding them of home, reminding where they once had power. I think that's kind of unique. So I circled all of this stuff if you need to help kind of identifying the parts. Okay. So one of the things that you might notice is that this is a little bit more complex and planned than we saw with that first mosque plan that we had. Can you see how this mosque was expanded over the centuries, right? So over those few hundreds of years where it was a mosque, it was made bigger and bigger and bigger. And the nice thing about a hypostyle hall is that you can just add more rows to the left, to the right, or in front, right? So it's really a nice plan for expansion. So as the population of Muslims grew in this region, they made the mosque bigger and bigger and bigger. There's actually 4 different expansions of this mosque. Okay, so in the interior, right, and you could probably put this on the architecture page in your note takers. This image is the images of the hypostyle hall. Okay, this has what we call horseshoe arches as well as piggyback arches. Okay, why do you think they call them piggyback arches? Why are they called piggyback? Who wants to volunteer? Sadie. Right, there's one on top of the other. And so you can see that these bassours, that's the different blocks in the arches, are multicolored, and that was favored by the Visigoths. They liked showing the different colors of the arches, but also this idea that they kind of like double on top. And they're called horseshoe too because they normally come in a little bit rather than going straight down. One of the things you'll notice underneath the restore, so the red and white blocks, is that we have these little columns. Those columns were spoils from Roman times. So they recycled and reused architectural structure from the Romans. And it wouldn't just been the temple of Janus that was on the site, it would be other ruins of the area as well. Okay, so this is the different styles of arches that we have in Islamic art. Here you can see the horseshoe where it kind of comes in, right? But we're also going to eventually see pointed arches. So pointed arches have a point at the top. Structurally, they are stronger than rounded arches. And that's one of the reasons why we start to see them in medieval times used on Gothic churches. As Gothic churches got bigger and bigger and bigger, they started falling apart, and because of crusades and seeing the architecture of Islamic structures, they would use that geometry to build their churches as well. Another thing we're going to eventually see is these niches that are almost like apses in a way, made by the arches, but inside of them, they have this undulated surface. They're called Merquanas. We will see this normally in the Qibla niche. There's like a Qibla dome often incorporated, and we'll see that inside the structures too. We'll come back to that. Okay, so this is what the hypostyle hall looks like when you kind of enter into the mosque. And as you get closer and closer to the mosque, you start to see, closer and closer to the Qibla wall, you start to see imagery like this. What's happening to the decoration? It's becoming much more elaborate, right? So it's directional, it's telling you that you are about to face or be able to get towards the Qibla wall and the mihrab. So I'm gonna go ahead and pause the recording so that we can see what this mihrab looks like. So let me. Okay, so remember, once again, the mihrab is just your directional niche, and this really just forces you to direct your attention to Damascus, right? Typical mosque though is Mecca. So I'll make sure we keep reiterating that. And then the decoration of this mihrab and this dome is all based on the COG. Can you see the calligraphy in gold with like a black background? Makes it really readable, right, from a distance. We see it in the borders, right? We see it in the borders. We see the arabesque, the organic vegetation in these triangular sections. Notice how it's what we call infinite arabesque. It really fills all the spaces. We don't have a lot of big flat areas. We don't have a lot of big open areas. Everything is highly decorative. We even saw that on the gate, right? It's all filled with elaborate detail, right? So this is the part that tells us. So that they're pointing themselves towards Damascus, emphasizing that that's where they were exiled from. Okay, so keeping into Spain, we're going to look at a later Islamic stronghold. We have the Nazarites from 1232 to 1492. This is in the city of Granada. One of the things that you might notice based on this contextual image that they've included in our image set is that it is, right, on a hill, right? So I have an image of it here. This is in the city of Granada. It's on a hill. What's strategic about the placement of the palace in correlation to the city? You got lost there?
Yeah, we went on a tour and I accidentally got separated from my group and no one around me spoke English.
Oh, that's exciting.
It was fine.
What's strategic about the city? Yeah. Right. It's elevated to show its importance, but also strategic, right? It's almost like fortified. And you have a plan for this one. And so, trying to dissect the plans, I was trying to figure out what they were actually getting at. They never really tell us exactly. But one of the things I wanted to mention based on that contextual image is that the palace was not only a palace or a series of palaces, it basically was a mini city within a city. Because we have Granada at the base of the valley, right? We have Granada in the base of the valley. And this was placed on a hill, and they often called the city Medina, right? Just like what we have, or Medina, right? What we had from Muhammad's life, the place that he exiled to. But in times of struggle and need, the people at the palace would allow Muslims in the city to come into the fortified walls of the palace. And so it was a pretty enormous structure, right? So on the outskirts of this is where the actual city was, right? There was a citadel. What's a citadel? What's a citadel? Bless you. What's a citadel? Talk to each other. What's a citadel? Okay, what is it? Who can volunteer? What do we say it was? Yeah, go ahead. Right. So a citadel is it's like a stronghold for military. And so it is where they kept their weapons, where they had their forces, right? So they'd have soldiers. It's where they would practice, right, combat. And so it was fortified and also had its own army. And the entire palace is really a series of 3 separate palaces that are joined together, and they were created by different rulers. So we have the Camaris Palace, the Palace of the Lions, and the Pardo Palace, and they were all built during different time periods in the 14th century. So when you look here, you can sort of see some of these basic structures for the different palaces. Right? So there are 4 exterior gates, right? 4 entryways into it. And the first 2 gates open to the north and the south. These were the ones that allowed people to come into the palace. And of course, they might come into for protection, but they also might come in to hold audience with the rulers that lived in the palace itself. So they would pay taxes for defense. They would pay homage to the rulers. It was an administrative center. Now, this link that I have at the bottom is basically like a guide to the Alhambra. So you can basically go into the different structures, the different rooms, and see basically 3D models, not really models, but 3D photos of the different parts of the structure. Okay, so one of the things that we see a lot on the outside of the palaces themselves is gardens, right? Why is garden imagery so important in Islam? What does it represent? Does anyone know? It represents the Garden of Eden, right? So in the Quran, just like in the Old Testament, there's stories of the creation stories. And we have the first, after God created the earth, we have these stories of this beautiful garden. And the garden was divided by 2 rivers into 4 different quadrants. So we actually see a lot of these plans of garden that emulate that garden imagery from the Quran. So there often is a water feature in a straight line or in a crisscross, right, to represent those divides. And then there is fruit trees and plants and flowers and water features, all to show the fertility of the earth, to represent that garden. They also have, kind of create these really nice quiet spaces before you enter into different parts of the structure. Right? This is probably the most famous palace, as well as the most famous image. It's called the Court of the Lions, right? This is part of that Lions Palace. And what you see here is stucco decoration. So this is all carved stucco surface using the COG, right? Using the COG. Now notice the water feature as well. There's a pool here and there's channels in the garden. So this one isn't like the lush garden that we just saw, but it still has that water feature. Now, one of the things that you might notice is that with this channel with the water, in the very center, there is a fountain. And this is called the Court of the Lions. Where does it get its name? Where does it get its name? From the fountain, right? Or at least that is imagery that was used to symbolize the Court of the Lions, right? Or the Palace of the Lions. Now, why is lions okay to use here? It's a living being. Why is this okay? Yeah.
Not a religious thing.
It's not a religious place. This is a palace. So palaces often would have figurative imagery or imagery of animals, mostly animals, right? Birds, no, tigers, lions, shouldn't say lots of tigers, but like lions, lots of regional animals. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that the lions still are not super realistic. And so that's something that we often see on Islamic secular imagery, that even though it's not necessarily it's a secular thing, not religious, it's not typically realistic in style. It's often abstracted in some sort of way. So we get an idea that's a cat-like creature, but it's not really a realistic representation of a lion. Okay, so this is all part of that water feature that represents Eden. Now, one of the other things, this is the reference image that we have in the 250, but this court, right, has like this little atrium hypostyle hall around it, right, holds it up. Men were basically allowed to walk amongst this area. The women were segregated here. They were normally on the top of the structure, and all of that deep shadow that's kind of hidden by the roof, there was a walkway, and the women could observe the beauty of the structure or the gardens inside, and they could view it from outside to kind of separate the sexes. So the surfaces have this really intricate pattern of decoration that's also based on geometric organization. Really slender columns, right? This is another part of our image set, and this is called the Hall of the Sisters. The Hall of the Sisters was residential apartments, right? So this was residential apartments for the family of the ruler. And they too have some of these water features and channels. You can see all that marble, right? That's on the surfaces. And of course, all of this has this kind of emphasis on using organic detail in a geometric pattern. This is El Mexor. This was the audience chamber. So it had an exterior audience chamber that was connected to a garden, and that also had an interior one as well. And this audience chamber was really known for where Ishmael I had his, where he would receive dignitaries, but also it's known for its geometric patterning. So the surfaces of the walls are very similar to this Camaris one. You see a lot of geometric patterning tile work on the surfaces of the wall. This is the Camaris Palace, and this is what it looks like in the interior. Right? MC Escher, you've probably seen his work. When he was like, college age, he toured Europe like so many people do today. And he studied all of that intricate patterning that he saw in the tile work and the stucco work at Alhambra. And he used it to basically figure out how to create those tessellations that he's so known for, right? So he was studying those interlocking patterns. So all of these images on the left come from the Alhambra, right? How do I make all this kind of interlock and kind of go in? It's all based on geometry and mathematics, right? This is not in our image set, but this is example, sort of like the Palace of the Sisters that we saw. There are these domes, and the domes are covered in Merquanas. This is like this series of little niches. And this one in particular is in the form of a star. So really complex dome. And it has all of this kind of stucco work coming from. Does it remind you of anything? Look at this, like scalloping here. Does it remind you of anything? Yeah.
Kind of like a beacon or a cave.
It reminds you of like a honeycomb, or I like the cave analogy. It's like stalactites and stalagmites. This was oh, I guess I don't have it in the animation. This was a music hall, and so it had great acoustics. It also was part of the residence that was used in the winter time. So it also, in a way, feels like snow in a way. Okay, I think we're going to end there today because there's really not enough time to go on. So we basically got done with 38. We'll work on 39 tomorrow.